Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our conference on causality, free will and divine action. Thank you for coming here. We wish you all a very successful and fruitful conference. There is enough time for you to have exchanges and conversations, and we have done everything to make it a fruitful conference in which we address the questions of this conference. And I want to give a brief summary of what the main motive behind the choice of that topic is. We can summarize the topic in the following question: can we know that there are no free actions of a certain sort or no divine interventions without examining the evidence? That means without examining, in the case of miracles, historical evidence, or without examining our inner perception of our actions or brain investigations. So can we know that there is no free will or no divine interventions without doing that? And that question is being asked by the conference and by our project because there is such a strong tradition of approaching these issues by principles which allow such an answer to these questions without the examination of the evidence. And these claims and these answers to these questions are based on certain principles such as determinism, causal closure, methodological naturalism, laws of nature, and a few others. So with these principles or basic metaphysical claims, impossibility arguments have been formed about free will of certain sorts as well as divine interventions. I want to give you just 3 quotations to illustrate that that's really the case. I think that this tradition is, at least in some areas, especially in the area of divine action, is a bit stronger in the German-speaking world than in the English-speaking world. But I want to highlight at the beginning of this conference that these are ideas that have been very influential in philosophy as well as in a wider context. And of course, if there are such impossibility arguments, that would be very handy first, because then we could give answers to these questions about the existence of free will and of divine interventions. And also it would be quite remarkable if we could gain this philosophical knowledge in that way. It would be quite remarkable if we could find out that determinism is true, for example, just by considering what it is to be a cause and what it is to come to occur for an event, and could then derive from that, well, it follows, and we can see, even from our philosophical armchair, that there is no free will of a certain kind, that there are no divine interventions. That would be a very successful and very quick argument, but of course the question arises, how could that be that we gain such substantial philosophical insights without considering the detailed evidence only through philosophical principles? So that is why these principles, such as determinism, causal closure, methodological naturalism, are at the focus of this conference. So that's our main focus, causality, but we have an eye on the implications for free actions and for divine interventions. To quote 3 authors who have used such impossibility arguments, let me start with Thomas Hobbes, who was perhaps the first to formulate determinism as we know it today. He, after considering philosophically what it is for an event to come to occur, he thinks, well, what is it? If an event comes to occur, then the cause must have been sufficient, and if the cause was sufficient, well, surely then it could not fail to cause what it did cause, and therefore he concludes what we today call determinism, and he expresses it by saying, whatsoever effects, that is, events, are hereafter to be produced shall have a necessary cause. He means a sufficient cause in our terminology. So that all the effects that have been or shall be produced have their necessity in things antecedent. And that is a very strong metaphysical claim, of course, about the actual events in our universe, and he derived it just from the philosophical armchair through thinking about what it is for an event to come to occur. And he does immediately draw also that conclusion that we are looking at for the question of free will. He concludes that ordinary definition of a free agent, namely that a free agent is that which, when all things are present which are needful to produce the effect, can nevertheless not produce it, implies a contradiction and is nonsense. He says that on the basis of his argument for determinism. So there we have one example of how philosophers used to argue against free will by philosophical principles. Now, a German example, an example from German theology, Friedrich Schleiermacher, clearly the most influential theologian in German theology. I have that only in German now. He came to reject his belief in Christian doctrine, and then when considering and writing about what's the main motive for his transformation of Christian doctrine, he refers to a certain conflict between science and miracles. And I quote that in German: Mir ahndet, dass wir werden lernen müssen, uns ohne vieles zu behelfen, was viele noch gewohnt sind, als mit dem Wesen des Christentums unzertrennlich verbunden zu denken. Der Begriff des Wunders in seiner bisherigen Art und Weise wird nicht fortbestehen können. Was soll dann werden, mein lieber Freund? Wollt ihr euch dennoch hinter diesen Außenwerten verschanzen und euch von der Wissenschaft blockieren lassen? So Schleiermacher is asking, thus far we are used to consider the essence of Christianity linked to miracles. We are used to think that miracles are essential for Christianity and for Christian doctrine. And then Schleiermacher claims, but miracles cannot be believed in any longer, and science makes that possible, Wissenschaft. So Schleiermacher asks, do you want to continue to believe in miracles and in traditional Christian doctrine when science is against you? Do you want a continuous conflict with science? And Schleiermacher's answer is no. And thus he presupposes that there is something from science, could be determinism, could be laws of nature, that excludes belief in miracles, and does so quite obviously. And then much later, Rudolf Bultmann in 1933 expressed this idea very clearly, and that was the dominating view in German theology for a long time. He says you cannot believe in miracles in the following words: the idea of a miracle as a divine intervention has become impossible for us today, because we understand all that happens in nature as law-governed. Thus we understand a miracle as a violation of the law-governed connection between all that happens in nature. And this idea we cannot entertain today anymore. Not because such an event would contradict all experience, but because for us the idea of nature includes being governed by laws, not because we observe this, but because we presuppose this. And we could not avoid this presupposition even if we wanted to. So that is a very clear statement of these impossibility arguments. We cannot believe in miracles any longer because of what we think about events, the causal connections, and laws of nature. So that is the reason why we are addressing causality in this conference, and that's the aspect which we will keep in mind when we ask questions about causality and laws of nature at this conference. Let me thank the John Templeton Foundation who made this event and our project possible. I think it is a great, deserves much admiration if somebody like Sir John Templeton leaves his fortune for leaving it for us to do research and to inquire into the big questions. So we are very grateful for their funding this conference. The team of that's organizing this and the team in our project, you find the names also on the table, on your handouts in your folder. It's Roderich Nolte. You can stand up briefly. Roderich Nolte, Aline Kuku, and Fabian Grassel. He will guide you through the program. Christoph Mocker. Friedrich Herzberg is another fellow of the project. And my colleague, Professor Alexander Batiani, has not yet arrived, but is also involved in the project and is also a professor at the IAP. With this, I wish you a very pleasant and successful conference, and Fabian Grassel will now guide you through the program.